it just kind of dawned on me, I know nothing about oysters other than they're delicious. And y'all think about this, conservation comes in many forms. You can put a bird box up, that's great. You can drink bird-friendly coffee, and you can recycle your oyster shells. And 1,000 other things that we can do that aren't really that hard. So, I'm glad Holly's here to talk about oysters, and I'm going to learn a lot. I hope you guys do too. Just make sure you send those questions to us in the chat box, and we'll get to them. If we don't get to all of them, we'll send an email out later with some information, including those answers. So y'all keep those questions coming, and I'll chat with Holly from time to time during the presentation to get those answered. All right, and we can go ahead and get it over to Holly.
Okay, I think I'm here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, you see me?
Yes.
Awesome. Guys, my name is Holly, and it's such a pleasure to be here today with you. This is the first webinar, so it's going to be a little weird not being able to hear your comments and your feedback. So if I make a little awkward chuckle now and then, that's probably why. I work SCORE program, which is part of SCDNR. SCORE is an acronym for South Carolina Oyster Recycling and Enhancement, and we work year-round to reclaim or recycle any oyster shell that we can possibly get our hands on. It so happens that the best way to maintain and to sustain oyster populations is by replacing that shell. Now, SCORE started in 2000, and since then we have worked with over 20,000 volunteers all throughout the United States, as well as we have brought some people from other countries to help us out as well. And those volunteers have donated over 43,000 hours to oyster restoration work throughout the South Carolina coast. We truly cannot do and meet our goals without the help of our volunteers. And this whole COVID pandemic has been really hard on us as staff, because one of our favorite parts about the job is being able to work with the community. I actually myself started out as a volunteer my senior year at Georgia Southern University. We went to the Ace Basin. Those of you, I'm sure you've heard of the Ace Basin before. It's a beautiful place. And we constructed a bag shell oyster reef. And at the end of the day, I was disgusting. I had scrapes, bruises all up down my arms because these bags, they are 20 to 35 pounds each. We had to move 350 of them twice, so from the trailer to the boat, and then from the boat to the shoreline. But still, at the end of the day, like, I was so happy to be there, and I knew that the work that we had done was going to make such an impact. And I had to get involved more. I knew that this was a program that I wanted to be more involved in, and I was actually hired on as an hourly 2 weeks after graduation. I can say this work isn't cut out for everyone. It is very labor intensive. The best way to monitor oysters is to actually get out in there and be in the mud, the stinky, silty pluff mud. I went to my bachelorette trip with super cut up legs. But I'm a firm believer that in order for someone to value something, they have to be understanding of why it's important. And so it's kind of my life's mission to educate you as a stakeholder about why oysters are important as natural resources and what you can do to help sustain them. So enough about myself. This is the man, and actually later in life, woman of the hour, the Eastern Oyster, or the Crassostrea virginica. And yes, oysters actually will change sexes throughout their lifetime. They start out as male, and will go through their first spawning season as male. But once they get a little bit larger and they have more energy reserved, they're able to develop ovaries and will typically change sexes into female and will typically spend the remainder of their life as a female. Just kind of cool, super nerdy fact I wanted to put out there. Now, the Eastern oyster, you're going to find this species all along the East Coast and down into the Gulf of Mexico. The same species, the one. However, they can be found intertidally as well as subtidally. And they are only found intertidally, meaning they are exposed during low tide, and then they are submerged during high tide in southern North Carolina down to northern Florida. And I point this out because even though they're the same species, because they are exposed to different environmental factors, being subtidal, they are always submerged, intertidal, they have that fluctuation, they actually grow differently. So your subtidal oyster is going to be the oyster that you typically see at restaurants. While as the intertidal oyster, which you can see in the bottom left-hand picture here, that's what our intertidal oysters look like, and they grow in super long, elongated clusters, one on top of the other. The subtidal oysters, because they're always submerged, they're in contact more with calcium carbonate, which what makes up their shell, so their shell is going to be thicker. But they're also being rolled and tumbled by the currents and by the tides, so they form that beautiful cup shape that just is able to hold all of that delectable juices when they're put on the half shell. And actually, fun fact, commercial fishermen not commercial fishermen, oyster farmers will roll and tumble their oysters because when oysters have that cup effect, they are more marketable to restaurants. And 95% of the oysters in South Carolina are intertidal. We do have some subtidal oysters here, but the intertidal oysters are much more prevalent. And to explain what it means by substrate limitation in South Carolina, which is my next bullet point, it's really important for you, as well as just continuing through this presentation, for you to understand a little bit about the oyster's life cycle. Now, most people, when they think of an oyster, they just think of it's stuck in the mud, it's not moving. And it's really cool to see their face light up when they learn that oysters, for the first couple of weeks of their life, they're actually swimming in the water column. So when the water temperature reaches like 68 degrees, the oysters start to spawn. And when a beautiful mama oyster loves a daddy oyster very much, they make the perfect little baby oyster, which is a larva. And that larva is swimming around for about 2 weeks, eating and eating, getting bigger and bigger. And then it goes into its final larval stage, which is this pettivillager stage. This is the stage where it develops this foot. And this foot works as kind of like a rotor, like a rotor on a boat. So it can really maneuver its way in the direction that it wants to go in the water. It's getting heavier now, so when it settles on the bottom, it ultimately needs something hard to settle on. And it uses that rotor to actually look for chemical cues from other oyster shell, because oyster shell has a chemical cue that the larva can detect, so that it can land on that oyster shell. It's kind of like an evolutionary thing. So it's like, obviously my family or my kind is doing well here. I can sense them. So I need to be there as well. And in the bottom left-hand picture with the oyster, the left picture of the oyster is just 1 to 2 day old spat. So it's considered spat once it has landed and cemented itself in place, and it's going to remain there for its entirety of its life. Just a couple of day old spat actually looks like little pepper specks. And just like in this picture, you'll see sometimes hundreds of these really super tiny pepper specks on one oyster shell. And then the left-hand picture of the oyster is about 3 months old. Now, this would be a part in my presentation where I would love to see a show of hands of how many people have been intimate with this stinky, stinky pluff mud that we know and love here in South Carolina. I certainly have. I have been quite literally swimming in it before, actually yesterday. And just like ourselves, if this larva lands on this pluff mud, which is full, our coastlines are full of this super silty pluff mud, that larva is going to sink, eventually it's going to smother out, and it's going to die. So it's super important for it to have something hard to settle on. And they'll find anything hard to settle on. They do prefer oyster shell, but this picture here is the perfect example with a bicycle of oysters that have settled all over it. I know when you're at boat landings, you'll see them all over the cement there. We'll actually purchase limestone to kind of that will also replant out onto the shoreline to kind of help us where we don't have to use as much oyster shell. We have a program where we will take repurposed crab trap reefs, we'll coat them in cement and put them into onto the shoreline, usually in places that are super, super pluff muddy, and oysters grow beautifully on there as well. So this picture here shows you what a beautiful intertidal oyster reef looks like. Not sure how old this oyster reef is, but it's very established. And just take a look and notice how these oysters are growing. So they are growing one on top of the other, year after year. More larvae is going to settle on the year before its shell and grow. And they create these crazy clusters and towers of shell. And I point this out because oysters are what are called ecosystem engineers. And that means that they themselves, as a structure, creates habitat. We actually have a saying here at SCORE that estuaries without oysters are estuaries without life. The reason we say that is because oyster beds are incredible for habitat. Over 150 different species rely on oyster reefs at some point in their life. They serve as homes for small, tiny invertebrates. The super silty pluff mud is just full of all kinds of nutrients for these small invertebrates to feed on, not to mention the super cute nooks and crannies that they can use to hide in. They're also important nursery grounds for some commercially important finfish that we have here in South Carolina. And of course, with more smaller species is going to attract larger prey, and that larger prey is going to attract more prey. And actually at low tide, it's very common for us to see super tiny, cute raccoon footprints along our oyster beds because they are going there to forage as well. Yes.
Hey, Holly. All right, so we had a couple people raise their hands about the pluff mud, but then we had a lot of comments. So we've had people that have face planted, just fallen in. We even had one that has made pluff mud angels. So if you haven't done that yet, I want to see pictures of that. Post them on Instagram. One of the questions, do those chemical cues diminish after the shell has been cooked? So say if you steam an oyster for, 10 or 20 minutes or however long you do it, do those chemical cues get broken down, or do you know anything about that?
No, so they do not get broken down. So so any shell really is made primarily of calcium carbonate, and there's something within that calcium carbonate that serves as a chemical cue. So
okay, awesome. And one other one, you might have said this at the beginning, but how long did they actually live?
Well, it's very dependent. They can live for a very long time, but they're super susceptible to desiccation because of the sun. Predation is a huge thing. I'm honestly not sure what the longest living oyster is, but some of our most established reefs are 5 to 10 years of
Wow.
age. So,
Okay. All right. Thank you, ma'am. I'll let you get to it.
all right. So the picture that you see here is an established reef that we built using bag shell, the shell that I was talking about that cut up my arms. This, I'm not sure how old it is. I think it's just a couple of years old because you can see where the sediment has settled in. But the cool thing about this is actually a great way for us to monitor these reefs to determine how healthy the environment there is, how diverse the animals are. But we will take and pull a bag from this reef, and us as staff will do what we call dissecting the bag, and we'll go and we'll pick through and find all of the living critters, take note of those. We will also literally pick out every single oyster shell that we had placed in the bags, but also ones that have grown on top, and we will take that into the lab and measure the size of spat. And again, remember that spat is after that oyster has landed and cemented, and we'll measure to see how much it has grown. So they'll grow about an inch a year, and then like in that picture before, we saw where it was, the spat was only a couple of months old and it was about this big. So that lets us know how well these reefs are thriving. But my most favorite thing about my job probably is that we'll also take these bags into the schools and allow school children to plunder through these oyster bags. And guys, I mean, as soon as we pull up a bag from the reef that we are choosing, you just see all kinds of mud crabs and marsh crabs, scatter. We see all kinds of worms. Sometimes fish, if we picked it up at a little bit when they're still submerged. But the kids absolutely love it. Sometimes I get a little more excited than they do, I feel, especially when we find some of these more eccentric finds that I have to tell you about. These are some of my favorite. So the first one is going to be the oyster pea crab. Now, if you have ever been to a oyster roast, you have certainly seen this oyster pea crab. The cool thing about this guy, it is a parasite to the oyster, but the cool thing about it is that they will actually find their host, the oyster, when both the pea crab and the oyster are in their larval state, and they will remain in that oyster as they grow. And the females will remain in there forever, while the males will leave for mating purposes. And apparently they taste really good. They're actually kind of a delicacy. And they are, how they're parasitic is they are going to be feeding off the mucus strands of the oyster's gills and eating any kind of detritus or phytoplankton that it finds, which of course is damaging to the oyster, but they don't typically just kill the oyster off. Yes.
First off, that's a disgusting diet of that crab. Mucus strands. I've never heard that word before. Okay, we had a couple questions. Well, I guess one of the most common critters, you're getting to that right now, that are found in those bags, but are oysters on the rise or decline in South Carolina?
So actually in South Carolina, we have a really healthy population of oysters, compared to around the world. We definitely have some issues just with we are certainly pulling in and harvesting more oysters than the local shell that is being replanted. And I'll get more into that a little bit later. But we have really good management practices here in South Carolina. So to say that they're on a decline, I don't think that that's true. However, I will ask specifically to one of my supervisors, but we're doing what we can to help sustain.
All right, and another question, I was wondering about this too. It says the spat that were, and this is referring to your pictures earlier, that were new looked like pepper, and it looked like there were hundreds of them. Said at the 3-month stage, the spat, that there weren't that many. Only a small percentage of those survive.
Oh yeah, certainly. And that's typically true to any kind of animal that's going to spawn so many babies out. A lot of them aren't going to survive. There, and the reason why is desiccation, but there are also other animals that are going to feed on these this spat as well. So definitely not the majority of them do not survive.
Okay, and just one more question. I'll let you go or continue here. There's a few questions coming in. You briefly mentioned using limestone rocks as a substrate. Is that an easily obtained substrate material to use?
We have been purchasing it, I think, from Florida, and the reason why we purchased it is because it is very easy to find. And from our bag monitorings that we have done, they do successfully recruit or allow oysters to grow on them. Definitely better in other low environmental conditions than some, but they are successful.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, so the oyster pea crab. Now, you're not going to see these ever when you're in a restaurant, but I promise you, they were there. That chef just knew that they were going to be unsightly, and they have taken them out. Actually, if you see an oyster pea crab in your oyster, it's actually a good sign, because these crabs are only going to be where the waters are very, very healthy. And the one oyster roast that I went to, I saw several of those. I didn't think it was particularly disgusting, but I certainly didn't try it. And I challenge you to try them next time you come in contact with one. Apparently they're good roasted or raw. They taste a little sweet, apparently. The next invertebrate that I really want to touch on is the spaghetti worm. So something about worms these kids just love. And the spaghetti worm happens to be one of the largest annelids that are associated with an oyster reef. We've seen some pretty huge ones. They actually live at the base of an oyster reef, burrowed into the mud, and during high tide, they are going to poke their little head out of the burrow, release these angel hair-like spaghetti strands, and they pull any kind of detritus that is floating in the water column that they can. So that's how they feed. Now notice the little red spot that kind of looks like blood at the head of the worm. It never fails. We get a screaming child thinking that they decapitated this worm, and I have to calm them down and explain that actually those are the worm's gills. And because pluff mud is a highly anaerobic material, there's not a lot of oxygen that available for this worm to survive. So also during high tide, it releases those gills and is able to pull in the needed gases to survive. So I think it's pretty cool. The next one is the sea squirt. Now, I have literally never seen an oyster that's this clean, nor a sea squirt. This has definitely been cleaned vigorously just for pictures. But the sea squirt is a cool little guy. So they feel kind of like balls of jelly. It's kind of hard to see, but they come with two little spouts that work as a siphon. So one is going to pull water in, while the gills are going to eat all of the detritus that it can, and the other one's going to pull water out. And to find these, kids are always just like, meh, it's not a big deal. But once you clean them off and you kind of point out the structures that they have, and if you give it a little squeeze and it just like shoots off some water, that usually gains their attention a little more. And they actually attach to the oyster shell. So they will be found attached to the shell. Now, my absolute favorite guy to find, hands down, has got to be the lemon drop sea slug. Most of these critters are a little more elusive to find, but this guy is particularly so just because, of course, it's not this clean. This is pluff mud we're talking about. This has definitely been washed very well, but they will suction themselves flat up against the oyster. They still do have that very distinctive yellow color, but of course it's not as prominent. And I'm always kind of proud of the child who ends up coming up to me with a lemon drop sea slug, because they're kind of hard to see. My favorite thing about them is they actually get their color from its primary food source, which is the yellow colored boring sponge, which actually looks like this. So this is the boring sponge here. It is actually eating that calcium carbonate, and it's been told they can be very detrimental to oyster populations. It's been said, when they're really bad, harvesters will go out and pick up a shell, and that oyster shell just crumbles in their hands, leaving behind the meat. So if you ever see an oyster shell that has a bunch of these holes in them, that is due to this awful boring sponge. Okay, so I know most about invertebrates just because I've had hands-on experience with them, and I just love little critters like that. But we can't talk about oysters without talking about birds that use this as food and as stopover grounds as well. Excuse me. I think my favorite so far, I don't know as much about birds as I want to. I actually purchased a little bird guide from the Seawee Outpost that's for shoreline birds or for shorebirds, and I'm excited to use that. But the oyster catcher is really cool. It's one of the only birds of its environment that can actually crush the shell and will eat the shell, and it will eat the oyster. So it has a catchy little tool of a beak that will stick inside of just an ever so slightly open shell, cut its abductor muscles, and snatch the meat out. Apparently, I haven't seen this in person, but apparently sometimes oysters get a little revenge by snapping down onto the oyster catcher's beak and holding it in place. I did find a picture on the internet of where an oyster catcher was trying to eat a clam, and that happened. And of course, I had to share that with you. But there are also so many other birds that will use reefs for eating fin fishes such as mummy chugs and anchovies. Some of the cool ones, of course, are the snowy egret. You can see it walking the lawn on the hunt for something good to eat. We have the great egret, the tricolored heron, and there are so many more. Again, I'm really excited to become more knowledgeable about that. Now, I can't talk about oyster reefs without saying how commercially important they are to us, because oyster reefs provide nurseries and feeding grounds for many commercially and recreationally important fin fishes, including black drum, red drum, spotted sea trout, sheep's head, anchovy, and so many more. But I kind of only really want to talk the most about this oyster toadfish. He's an ugly little fellow. He's also really cool. So this guy aggressively feeds on oysters, worms, shrimp, crab, pretty much any and everything that it can snap those chompers on. Take a look at just the massive amount of teeth that this guy has. Excuse me. And they are scaleless fish, so they have kind of like a smooth, mucousy feeling body. They always have like little tentacles and warts poking out, probably really great at luring in those fish that they want to eat. My husband actually said that when fishermen catch these guys, it's really, really hard for them to get their mouths open because their jaws are so strong. So apparently they make a specific tool that they can use to like latch in there and take them off of the hook without damaging it. I thought that was cool. But my favorite thing about these guys is actually I came upon a clip of them. So when they are they're ready to spawn, the males will give out this very manly yelp. I hope that you can hear it. Let's see if we can get this started. Now, ladies, I don't know that I would be too attracted to this, but it sounds like a foghorn. Anyway, I thought it was cool. I encourage you guys to look into this company called Toadfish. They actually sell all kinds of different fishing gear, and for every sale they'll actually take a percentage of that and will use that money to help restore reefs. So oysters serve as ecosystem engineers, but they're also really important for helping to maintain water quality. So oysters are filter feeders. As soon as they're submerged, they are going to beat those gills and they're going to pull water towards them and get anything that's suspended in the water column into their system. They can actually filter 2.5 gallons of water every single hour. So like 50 gallons of water every day. Again, remember that our oysters here are intertidal. And when you compound that number, that is a ridiculous amount of water filtration that is going on. So oysters are primarily feeding on phytoplankton, but they're also going to pull out any kind of pollutants that's in the water. And unfortunately, of course, this is bad for oysters, but they will either incorporate that into their system or they will excrete that out as pseudofeces. Now, just so you guys aren't afraid, DHEC does a really good job with testing the waters, and they will open and close shellfish grounds to harvesting depending on how healthy that water is. And there are some sites, such as out here in the harbor, that will always be closed because there's no way that water system is going to be clean enough to eat those oysters. You got a question?
Hey, it kind of fits in. There was a question earlier, are they safe to eat with the waters warming? But I guess DHEC is going to be doing the testing and everything before they're allowed to be sold.
Well, actually, you brought up a good point. So when the waters are, you only want to eat oysters that are harvested here when the waters are cooler. And that's because during the warmer months, there is going to be harmful bacteria that will be prevalent and really growing strongly during those times. So you do not want to harvest your own oysters or eat oysters from a place that's harvested in warm waters. So that was a good question.
Okay, and kind of a specific question here. Have y'all noticed any shell damage from acidification due to the waters absorbing carbon dioxide?
Ocean acidification is certainly something that we are concerned about. I don't know that there are currently any research that is going on to determine that. That would be a great question that I could ask the shellfish research section here at MRD. So I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, and again, we'll try to find the answers for you. And just one more, is there a chance we won't be able to eat oysters in the future due to climate change?
Well, it is known, so oysters can only they have a certain salinity limit that they can survive in. And as water temperatures increase and we're going to have oceans being infiltrated with more salt, oysters most likely won't be able to survive. So yes, it's definitely something that we are concerned about. Actually, kind of to bring on talking more about the water quality and what they can survive in. I think it was sometime last year, there was a huge oyster die-off in the Gulf of Mexico because of a huge influx of fresh water that came from further up north. And I mean, it killed off a very large amount of oysters. So any kind of climate change will certainly impact these guys greatly. And then, of course, with them being a keystone species, there are so many other species that rely on them. So definitely something that we think about often.
All right, thank you.
So oysters help with controlling eutrophication, which is kind of a little hard to understand, but because they eat phytoplankton, they're eating algae from the water column. That means that there won't be as likely to have algal blooms. So anytime there is extra nutrients that are making it into the waterway, such as from runoff, like from fertilizers or from sewage, there's going to be an excess of nutrients in the water. And that is perfect opportunities for algae to really, really procreate and become very abundant, which leads to algal blooms. Now, once all of that algae dies off, the process that it takes to decompose that algae actually will really eliminate the dissolved oxygen in the water column, which is what leads to the huge, massive fish die-offs that we see. So that's something that oysters can really help with as well. And then the picture that you see here to your left just shows how oysters can really improve water quality. So these oysters were taken from a site along with water that was in the same site. And then over a couple of hours, you can see how well it was able to really flush through all of that. Now, of course, these are perfect conditions, but it is a good visual to see. And then the benthic pelagic coupling, that just means that they're taking those nutrients out of the water column in the pelagic, excreting anything that they can't digest, but there are other organisms that can. So they're bringing it onto the seafloor, the benthic, so something else can take care of it, which would not happen if the oysters were not there. So this is one of my favorite parts to show. So oysters as natural breakwaters. So our shorelines are always going to be subject to erosion due to storm surges, more development, and boat wakes. I definitely encourage you guys next time you are on a boat to traveling down our coastline, take a look to the left and to the right and see if you notice any erosion. And then pay attention to those boat wakes that are eventually going to make it to the shoreline. The pictures that you see here are erosion, and they're happening everywhere. It is very prevalent. I'm going to show you this video. So this video was taken by our shellfish research section, and I'm just going to put it in a good spot. So you see several different constructed oyster beds here. One of them is just an experimental form there, and the one above that that's further out is a bag shell reef. And they're going to drive a boat down the coastline, and watch how that wake meets the shoreline. So when this water has a lot of energy behind it, and when it meets the shoreline, it starts to break it away. But when it meets the oysters, you can see very obvious that it really slows down and that energy is dissipated. And the reason that happens is, again, with all of those nooks and crannies, that water has to flow through those nooks and crannies, and that energy really, really dissipates. Let's see, going back to my presentation. Okay, perfect transition. And with this, oysters are really good to promote marsh regrowth. Thinking back to that video again, so when that water rushes through those nooks and crannies, it slows that water down, and that allows sediment to fall out of the water column and to settle. So the pictures that you see here, we started out as a blank slate in 2007. The reef was built in 2008. You can see that there's definitely a lot of sediment deposition that has happened between all of those oysters. And if you were there, you would notice that behind that reef as well, there's a lot of sediment deposition. And just 2 years later, there are already signs of that marsh grass starting to regrow and fill in behind that reef. We actually do, and then in 2011, just how grand that change is. We actually do a side project called Seas to Shoreline, where we work with school children and we will raise salt marsh grass from seeds. The children will actually plant those seeds. We bring them to our greenhouses, and when it's time, when they're fully grown, we will plant those behind our oyster beds, just to kind of help give it an extra boost. We actually just finished our last planting this past week, of course without volunteers, which I really hated. So this image here just breaks down the commercial seafood industry in South Carolina. And notice that oysters are ranked 4th in the economic scale for the commercial seafood industry. And, oh, excuse me. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so they rank 4th in the economic scale in the seafood industry, but also notice that finfish are the top. And again, remember that so many finfish use our oyster reefs as nurseries for their young. So really, we are supporting, these oysters are supporting for these finfish to thrive. And oysters are huge, huge culturally important to the Lowcountry throughout. There are probably 3 dozen oyster roasts that happen every single weekend during oyster season, especially along the coast. And a lot of our recycled shell will come from these oyster roasts. And unfortunately, due to COVID, we are expecting there to be a huge decline in these community-based oyster roasts. And so therefore, it's going to be more responsibility on the individual to make sure that they are recycling that shell.
Hey there, Holly. If you don't mind if I interrupt really quickly, our special guest has joined us. So I want to introduce him, and why don't we go ahead and stop sharing your screen if that's all right.
Okay, stop share.
Perfect. Okay, so we at the South Carolina Wildlife Federation are so honored to have Congressman Joe Cunningham, who represents South Carolina's 1st Congressional District, joining us today. As a member of the House Committee on National Resources, and more specifically, the Waters, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittees, today's topic on oysters is of great interest to him and his Lowcountry constituents. So, Congressman, I welcome you to share your video and share a little bit more about some of the highlights of your committee's work with us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on here, and I'm glad to see Holly here from DNR's SCORE program. You know, my team had the opportunity, I guess, was it last year? I think last year. It feels like an eternity ago. This whole pandemic has put everything, you know, into a different perspective. But remember, we're helping SCORE bag and recycle thousands of oyster shells, and I cannot stress how you know, how important this is for the sustainability of our shorelines. Here in the Lowcountry, we're watching literally by the week, beaches disappear and our shorelines erode, and property is threatened as a result of climate change and rising sea level. So in the wake of all that, it's good to see such projects like Living Shorelines, and because they present an incredible opportunity to not only stabilize shorelines, but provide wildlife habitat, and build natural resilience for these areas. So just like I said, incredible program, and I was glad to see last year had the chance to see firsthand the shorelines that were maintained, and then the things that the shorelines that were gained by these type of shoreline stabilizers out there on Goldbug Island. So but as you said, I know everybody's doing everything they can on their front. I got to tell you, as a member of the Natural Resources Committee, we're doing everything we can to bring some attention to this, and we've gotten a lot done. I was proud to work with Republican colleague Garrett Graves to pass an amendment into the Living Shorelines Act of 2019 to help communities dealing with accelerated land loss apply for grants to carry out these living shoreline projects. I think that this bipartisan legislation creates a federal grant program through NOAA to assist states, localities, NGOs in constructing these living shorelines. So I was also proud to be the original co-sponsor of the Shovel Ready Restoration Grants for Coastlines and Fisheries Act of 2020. Kind of rolls off your tongue there, doesn't it? But this was a big one. It created a $3 billion restoration fund that includes living shorelines and oyster reefs. And so eligible projects include like habitat restoration, debris removal, and green infrastructure projects that make our coastal communities like the Lowcountry here, more resilient and more sustainable in the face of economic and environmental stress. So and that's just this is just our first term here. So we're very excited for the things we've gotten done and the things that we have to do in the future as well. But it's been just an absolute pleasure working with all of you all in our shared and common goals.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Joe. And before we let you go, we have to find out, what is your preferred way to eat oysters? Because that was a lively conversation at the beginning.
Yeah, of course. I would say naturally washed down with a Lowcountry beer, preferably an IPA.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And Holly, we will turn it back over to you to continue on sharing so much wonderful information. Congressman Cunningham, we really appreciate you joining us and just sharing more about your work, especially on the coastline, because it is one of our most valuable resources here in South Carolina.
Yeah. That's why we live here.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, Holly, we will turn it back over to you. Thank you.
All right. I love that. Okay. Screen share. Are we good?
Yes.
We are good.
Okay. So that was great information. Just to touch base so you can understand just how heavily oysters are consumed here in South Carolina. Now, these values are, of course, rough estimates, but commercially imported oysters from other states, as well as recreationally harvested, are about 100,000 bushels per year for every single one. Recreationally, it's really, really hard to get those values, and actually, this we expect it to be much higher than just 100,000. And so that means that there are 300,000 bushels of shell available to be recycled. And we are only, at this point in time, we are only recycling 10% of that every year. It has gotten better over past years, but it's just heartbreaking to know that we can do much better. Now, in the past, there used to be a lot of oyster canneries. So there were like 16 oyster canneries in South Carolina. that would harvest millions of oysters, thousands of bushels every single year. The thing about these, though, is they were also required by law to hold on to that shell and to replant it for that next season. And this was great because it's all in one place. Now, harvesting pressures are the same, if not more, and the shell is completely spread out all throughout the state. So it's replanting local shell has really lagged behind harvesting since the last cannery closed in 1986. We never, ever, ever recycle as much shell, the amount of shell that we need for our replanting goals. And therefore, we have to outsource and purchase shell from other states. And that deems to be very expensive. So loose shell and the transport of that shell continues to increase in price. So it used to be about $1 a bushel, and now it can be as much as $5 a bushel. This year, I think we were able to purchase it at like $3.50 a bushel. But when you purchase 35,000 bushels of shell just this past year, you know, you can do the math and understand that that's a lot of money, and we could really, really decrease the amount of shell that we purchase with education and action from members of the community. So about our oyster shell recycling, I'm almost done here, guys. I know it's close to an hour. I'm just nerding out hard because I love what I do. But it's a free service that we provide to over 51 restaurants in Charleston. We also have a small recycling team that works remotely in Hilton Head as well as Greenville. But we provide the recycling containers and then service them multiple times a week. We have some caterers that we work with as well. And there are, I think it's actually more than 33 public drop-off spots that are available to the public to drop off their shell. It's important to note that every single bushel counts, truly. It doesn't matter if you're just eating a bushel of oyster shell. It actually takes, I think it's 3 bushels of shell will equal, I think, oh man, I wish I had the numbers. It's ridiculous. I will make sure to get back with Jay with that. But it's pretty incredible just how much just 3 bushels of shell has the ability to spread out across the shoreline and make a difference. As a way to really educate our public and make it easy for the public to be aware of where these drop-off locations are, we have developed an interactive map. And this map can be found at this website right here. You could just type in your address and then find where the closest drop-off location is. We actually did a pilot program with Charleston County where we provided posters at seafood markets, and the poster showed customers where the nearest drop-off location is. That happened last year. We just got the results back, and we had a 250% increase of recycled shell that we picked up from public drop-off bins. It's incredible. So this year we are working, and we have done this in the past, but it really wasn't kept up. But we are working to make it county-based and provide a handout for every customer that purchase oysters, where it will show them on the back all of the drop-off locations within the county and the addresses of how to get to them. And we really hope that that's going to help, especially since we are expecting the community-based oyster roast to really heavily decline this year. So once we get that shell into our possession, we do what we call quarantine. Now, the shell has to quarantine for at least 6 months, and that just allows all of the stinky, nasty, dead tissue to die off. And this is particularly important since we are getting it from other states. We don't want to introduce any kind of harmful bacteria into our water system. And I also have to point out the bag of trash that you see here. It never fails. Anytime humans are involved, we tend to make it a little trashy. We find all kinds of trash from oyster roasts and restaurants in our shell. We actually, as staff members, historically, we have spent days going through, turning over the shell, and picking through as much trash as we possibly can. Just this past year, we made it a volunteer event, which isn't the most best smelling volunteer event, but it makes a huge difference because this shell is being put directly back onto the shoreline. So replanting. I'm mainly going to touch on how SCORE themselves, how we replant, but it's also important to mention that commercial harvesters play a huge role in helping to manage our oyster populations. As their permit requires, they have 50 bushels per acre that they have to replant via live oysters, alternative culture, or cultivation, which is basically just raking apart super heavily clustered oysters to spread them out. And this year, for 2020, commercial harvesters will have 91,000 oysters to replant, or the equivalent of that. So they play a huge role in helping us manage these systems. So we have two main ways that SCORE helps to replant the shell onto the shoreline. The first one is funded through the saltwater fishing license sales. They're only $10, so please take a look at the website below and help us fund what we are trying to do here. But we will load about 1,000 bushels of oysters using this crazy skid steer, which is fun, onto a barge. We will then take that barge out at high tide to sites that we have determined to be good spaces to plant oysters on, and we will blow the oyster shell off with a huge water gun cannon. I've got to show you this cool video. Super short, but it's so fun. Let's see. So this is the process. It feels really powerful as a woman, especially, to be in charge of that water cannon. I don't know why. But yeah, we just blow the water off, and a lot of other states do this as well. We plant about 45,000 bushels of year annually this year, and we have created over 50 acres of oyster reefs in this way. And this is just showing, this is what it looks like after planting. So blank canvas, it's been planted. 2007 and 2011, a beautiful established oyster reef there. And that brings me to the second way, which is our bag shell reefs. So volunteers will help us bag the shell using these very handy dandy tubes. So they put the shell in these mesh bags. This is what I was saying, where we unload 350 bags onto boats. We take them to the shoreline and we plant them. And this just shows all of the sites that we have, that SCORE has built all across the coast. And it is just, it's a beautiful way to get the community involved, and one of my favorite opportunities with our volunteers. Yeah, so that's all I have for you today. Just some take-home messages. I really encourage you guys to take the information, the overload of information that you have learned today, and please go out and educate your neighbors and your friends. We can't do it all on our own. When you're at a restaurant, ask if that restaurant is recycling their shell. If you're at an oyster roast, make sure that your friends are not just tossing that shell out across their dock, because most likely it's just going to sink, not do well. Make sure they are recycling it. And if you have to, take the initiative to recycle it yourself. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is here. I wanted to point out these important websites just so you guys had them. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for allowing me to spend this time with you. I hope that you learned a lot.
Thank you, Holly. This was an awesome class, but you're not out of the woods yet. Do you still have some time?
Yes, I do. Please shoot them at me.
All right, cool. Well, one question, are other states doing this as well, recycling?
Yes, they do. This apparently SCORE was actually the first state to really take it on. SCORE was the first state SCORE was the first program to do this. But yes, we actually have been looking at the $1 Million Oyster Project, I think it's called, it's based in New York. It's upscaled tremendously, and we are working to kind of base our practices on them to really increase what we are doing here. So yes, it is very common.
Cool. And we have another one. Are the bag shells and loose shell recycling helping only the intertidal oysters?
Well, when we're out there planting, you're going to plant further into the water column than just the intertidal zone. I'm not very familiar with subtidal oysters whatsoever, so I can't say exactly. But I can find out for you for sure.
Okay, thank you. And this is kind of interesting. How far inland will oysters grow?
I'm not sure. So they're found in estuaries. So anywhere where there's going to be that influx of fresh and salt water, you will see oysters.
Okay. And sorry, I'm trying to keep up with these questions, but I was just thinking, so I live in Chapin. There's a few restaurants around here. If to kind of promote this, can we just go to restaurants and tell them about this? And like, say, if they are interested, can I say, hey, I've got a truck, every, 2 weeks, can I pick up your oysters? Like, how does that part work?
And where did you say you're from? Actually, I'm not from here, so.
Just outside of Columbia, about 30 minutes.
Okay, yeah, that's great, actually. We have partnered with Pew as well as CCL, Coastal Conservation League, and they are working to really build remote recycling teams, much like those in Hilton Head and Greenville, that will take volunteers such as yourself and will start a recycling route. So us, DNR, we would provide a recycling trailer. We would provide any kind of materials that you needed, such as the receptacles. It would just be, you would have to use your personal truck to tow that trailer. So that is a good question. And if you are interested in that, please reach out to me. I have some very good resources for you.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. Let's see. Let me check the chat box here. A lot of thank yous, Holly. Awesome information. Let's see. All right. Cynthia, we'll connect you with Holly, or you can email her directly. I think that we got to all the questions. Sorry if we didn't get to any of them. It's kind of, we've got a bunch of comments and questions coming through. Where are best places to go to get oysters? I'm assuming,
okay.
Yeah, so I'm assuming to eat. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to take it as to harvest yourself, because you can harvest oysters yourself. If you're going to do that, however, you have to make sure you have a saltwater fishing license. And on our DNR website, you will find what grounds are harvestable. So what we have it mapped out, and we update it regularly based on what DHEC says are healthy waters. And then we also close grounds if they have been over harvested. So if you're interested in that, email me and I'll help you out.
Okay. All right, great. And that $10 saltwater fishing license, that's for a whole year, correct?
Yes.
Wow, that's a deal. So y'all, even if you don't fish, get a fishing license. You know, there's a lot of 6-packs that they sell now, you know, of beer that cost $15. So you know, $10 to save our coastline, you know, is that's a deal. So grab your license. Holly, thank you so much. You did a great job. We appreciate you, and so did everybody else on this webinar. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, I loved it. I had such a great time.
All right. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and close this down, and hopefully we'll see you next year.
Yeah, definitely. Have a good one, guys.
All right. See you.